How's it going, guys? My name is Dom, and today we're going to be creating a datetime widget using HTML, CSS, and of course JavaScript. It's going to look something like this. As we can see, we have two parts. We have the time part, and then we have the date. So this right here is going to represent the current time, and as your minutes or your days go by, it's going to update automatically without the user doing anything. Now, something like this does seem relatively straightforward and simple, but we're actually going to be using quite a few different technologies such as string formatting, the date object itself, set interval. We're going to be covering JS doc briefly, and as well as including fonts from Google Fonts to get custom fonts. And as per usual, all of the source code is going to be linked down below if you would like to download and follow along while you watch today's video. Okay, so when it comes to the code for this datetime widget, we can see here I've got this empty index HTML with nothing inside the body. I've also linked up a CSS file as well as a JavaScript file right here inside the head. And we can see they currently sit within a directory called CSS for the CSS file, then of course JS for the JavaScript file. Now, if you're going to follow the same setup as this right here, it's very important you guys also include the defer attribute on your JavaScript tag. This way, the script is only going to execute once the document has been loaded, and you don't run into errors regarding, unable to find elements and things like that. So once you have the same setup as this, we can now begin in the HTML before moving on to the CSS and then lastly the JavaScript to of course build this datetime widget. So for the HTML, it's going to be relatively straightforward. We're going to have this main parent div with a class of datetime, and this right here is going to contain elements for both the time and the date. So in the example that I showed you earlier, the time is going to be at the top and the date on the bottom. So we can follow the same structure in the HTML. So we'll say here a new div with a class of time and a second one here with a class of date. And this is all we need when it comes to the HTML structure for this datetime widget. Now, I'm also going to include some dummy data inside both of these elements here, just so we can actually see something when we get to the CSS to, of course, style these up. So for the time, I'll just say 10:37 a.m. And for the date, I'll just say something like June 9, Thursday, June 9, 2022. So I'll save this here, go back in the browser, and we can see we end up with something like this. So of course we can now use CSS to convert this right here into this right here. All right, let's go back inside VS Code and head into the CSS file. So when it comes to the CSS, we can begin by setting a dark background on the body. So we'll just say here 222. This of course isn't directly related to the datetime widget, but it's going to look a bit nicer on the eyes. And we can drop down now and begin targeting the datetime widget itself. So this is where the majority of the CSS is going to be held. So for this one here, we can set a base font size of 16 pixels. So we have this 16 pixel base font size, and both the date and the time are going to receive font sizes relative to this here. I'm going to show you more on this later on, but for now we can set this base font size. Let's give this a padding of 24 pixels, a text color of white, okay, a background of a lighter gray than the body, so we'll just use 444 here. I'll save this, go back in the browser, and we end up with something like this, okay? Back inside VS Code now, we can also apply a box shadow on this container here. We'll say 0, 0, 10 pixels, then RGBA, and give this a 25% opaque black background, box shadow. Let's also give this a border radius of 4 pixels alongside a border right of 10 pixels. Then using the dcode green color, we'll say 009578 and give this a style of solid. I'll save this, go back in the browser, and we end up with something like this. We have that box shadow, the border radius, and of course that green bar on the right side for the border. Let's head back inside VS Code now and finish off the CSS for this container. We're going to be giving this a width of 400 pixels here, as well as a font family of sans serif. We're going to be changing the font family once we're done with the CSS and load in a custom font from Google Fonts to make it look a little bit nicer. But for now, we'll just say sans serif. I'll save this, go back in the browser, and we end up with this right here. As we can see, if I go back to the example, it's the same width, but the font size is so much larger in the example, so we can now update the font sizes to, of course, reflect what they should be. Back inside VS Code, let's now target the time. So when it comes to the time part, we can begin by setting a font size of 3 EM. Now, because the time element is a child of the date time, okay, this EM just means 3 multiplied by the current font size. And because we set the base in the parent, it's basically just, look, 3 times 16, which gives us something like, let's just figure it out real quick. 16 times 3, okay, 48, all right? Under pressure, it's hard to do math, guys, so I apologize, but this just means 48 pixels, 3 times 16, okay? We can also give this a color of 009578, and I'll just scroll up here and pick the light green, just like that. We'll save this, go back, and we get this right here. Head back into CSS once again. We can target the date this time, and we'll give this a margin top of 12 pixels. This right here is simply just half of what we set for the padding. Now you may wish to use CSS variables here and the calc function to make this a little bit more dynamic and reusable, but I'll just hard code 12 as half of 24 here, and a font size of 1.75 EM or 1.75 times 16. I'll save this, go back in the browser, and we end up with this right here. So we are now done with the CSS, mostly aside from the font change. So when it comes to loading custom fonts on your website or your application, it's very straightforward using Google Fonts. So if I go inside this tab right here, I'll leave a link to this below as well. Google Fonts lets you choose from a bunch of open source fonts, which you can use on your website. So I want to choose the font called Inter here. I used this inside the example, so I'll just scroll down here and there it is right there. You can also search by category, by language, font properties, so on, but I'll just search for this one here. Go down here now and click on the font, all right? And now I can then choose my styles. So when it comes to my widget here, I want to use the font weight of medium 500, okay? The regular 400 is the standard font weight, when you have something like this, but 500 is a little bit thicker and I like how it looks more. So I'll choose medium 500. Then on the right side here, you can view your selected fonts. It says Inter medium 500. I can now just simply copy the links here, which is provided to me. Then go back in the HTML and just paste this at the top inside my head. And now I'm free to use the Inter font within my web page. So let's go back in CSS and change the font family here to be Inter and then sans serif. Now we'll notice that essentially, because I've only loaded up the 500 font weight, this right here is going to be 500 by default. So it might be better to explicitly tell Chrome to use a font weight of 500. So let's go back inside here now and just say, look, font weight, and make it 500. I'll save this. We should see no changes. As we can see here, there's no changes. So we're fine with that. And we have this nice font loaded on the web page. You may also wish to use like a digital font if you would like to, but I'm going to stick to this nice Inter font. Okay, great. So the HTML and the CSS is done. We can now move on to the JavaScript. Before jumping into the JavaScript though, I do want to remove the placeholder time and date. That way we're going to know that the values are going to come directly from JavaScript. So if I go back in the browser now, it's going to be empty. Cool. Let's head inside the main.js file here. First step is going to be to get a reference to both the time and date HTML elements. So we'll say const time element equal to document.query selector and select the first element with a class of time. There's only one in the HTML, so of course it's going to be this div right here. And the same goes for the date. So date element, selecting the class of date. Great. So now we can define basically two functions which are going to format the time and also the date. All right. So let's write a new function here called format time. Now this function is going to take through a date object. So we'll say date here, just like that. So it's going to take this date. So remember, a date object in JavaScript represents a point in time. It's called a date, but it actually contains time information as well. So let's just add some JS doc here as well. It's an optional step, right? But it's going to let us provide the data type here. That means VS Code can then know that this right here is a date. So we'll get things like date dot, and we get this, autocomplete for all of these different methods we can call. So more on this shortly, okay? Actually, let's talk about that right now. So when we want to format the time, basically, we want to return from this function here, right? We want to say, for example, 10:57 p.m. We want this result from this function. So we're going to take this date and swap out these values with the actual values from the date. Okay, cool. Let's hop up here and we're going to say const hours 12 equal to, then we can say date dot get hours mod 12 or 12. So this right here is going to grab the current hours from this date object. Now, this hours here is going to be a number between 0 and 23. It's in 24-hour time, okay? Then it's going to say mod by 12, which means, look, get the remainder of the division of 12. And this right here is going to basically convert your 13 into a 1. So you can say 13, 1 p.m. or 15, 3 p.m. and so on. If the result of this is 0, it means it's either midnight or midday. So we say or 12 because 0 or 12 is going to give you 12. So we're simply choosing 12 over 0 here. Now I want to just stop here and sort of run this code because I feel like I'm talking too much and not actually explaining this properly. So let's just simply return hours 12, whatever this is from this function temporarily, okay? Then I'll go back in the browser. Now I'm going to say here, format time, so calling that function and pass in a new instance of the date. So when I say new date, this just means make a new date object of the current date time. I'll press enter and we get 11. It is currently 11 p.m. So I get 11 there, okay? If I was to say new date dot get hours, which we did inside that function, it gets 23. And we're taking that 23, mod 12, give us 11, so we get 11 p.m. That's all this is doing. It's basically converting your 24-hour time into 12-hour time. Cool. Let's make a second part here. We need the minutes as well. So we'll say here minutes equal to date.getMinutes, and it's going to be as simple as that because minutes right here, it's going to give you a number between 0 and 59 for the current or whatever the date object contains for the minutes part, okay? Then down here, we can use JavaScript template strings, so the backticks near the 1 on your keyboard, and we'll say here using $ and curly braces, we'll say hours 12, colon, then simply minutes, okay? I'll save this, go back in the browser, I'll run the format time again, and this time I get 11:18. It's currently 11:18 p.m., all right? Great. So the problem with this is if the current time was if the minutes is between 0 and 9, then it's only going to be a single digit. So you might see something like 11:9 instead of 09. So we need to pad and add those zeros to these numbers if they don't already exist. So we'll say here for both of these hours and minutes dot toString. So converting it to a string allows us to then use a method called pad start. And we'll say, let's pad the start for 2 characters and replace them with zeros. This just means, look, it's going to guarantee that this number is going to be at least 2 characters in length, okay? And any remaining stuff is converted to a 0, giving us from obviously 9 into 09, just like that, for both the hours and the minutes, okay? Save this back in the browser, and now we can see we get 1120, the same result, but like I said, it's going to be different if one of these was, a single digit. Now, how do we get the AM or PM? It's very straightforward, okay? Let's go back inside here, make a new constant called is AM. This right here is going to be a true or false. If it's true, then it's AM. If it's false, it's not AM, or it's PM, right? So we'll say here, if date.getHours is less than 12, then you're in AM. Once again, this get hours is going to be between 0 and 23. So if you're 12 or under, you're in AM, so it's going to return true. Then simply at the end of this string here, we can add a space. Once again, using curly braces, we can say if it is currently AM, okay, $, we can say AM, otherwise we can say PM, just like that. So is AM, AM, otherwise PM. Save this back in the browser and we get this right here, 11:21 PM. Perfect. So we have the time part out of the way. This right here was the most complex part probably of today's video. So that is all done. We can now move on to the exact same thing, this time for the date section. We'll say function format date. It's going to accept a date here. And once again, we can copy the same JS doc from above here to give us those type hints, just like that. All right. Then we'll say down here, because when it comes to this one here, we need to display the month as well as the day of the week. So unfortunately, the date object has something like get day. This right here is going to return you the day of the week between 0 and 6. So indexed at 0. The same goes for get month. It's going to give you the month between 0 and 11. So that right there makes it convenient for you to use an array and then convert the numerics into a string. So I'm going to copy and paste what I had earlier because it'll take a while to write out, but basically I'll paste this in here. You guys are also free to, of course, download this code and copy it yourself, but I'm making 2 constants here, one for days, one for months. It's going to be simply an array of every single weekday and then every single month. So then we can say days at index 0 is going to be Sunday, and the same thing for the month. So we can use this in combination with those getters on the date object, like this, to then simply grab out the string version of those days or months, okay? And this right here is going to be pretty straightforward. We can simply return using template strings once again, and we'll say here, $ curly braces, days at index dates dot get day, just like that. Okay, so convert your day into a string version. Then we'll say, so for example, Thursday, comma, then we'll say, what's it going to be? Month. So Thursday, June something, right? We'll say month, just like this, and we'll say date.getMonth. Okay, then we can say space, and now we can present or we can insert the actual date itself, so between 0 and 31 or 1 and 31. We'll say here, curly braces, date.getDate. So get date is going to return you that numerical between 1 and 31, day of the month. Then say space again, and this time get the full year. So we'll say date.getFullYear, giving us the 2022 as an example. Let's now save this. Hold on 1 sec. Let's make this months instead. Let's now save this, go back in the browser, call this time the format date, press enter, and we get Thursday, June 9, 2022, just like that, okay? So we have both the format date and the format time functions done. We can now make use of them down here inside a set interval. So set interval is going to run your function, which you pass inside here, every set amount of milliseconds. So we'll say here as an example, 200. So every 200 milliseconds or 1/5 of a second, it's going to run this function. This function is going to simply create a date object for the current time and then populate these elements with the corresponding date times. We'll say here, const now equal to a new instance of dates. Then drop down here and just say time elements dot text content equal to format time, then pass in the date and do the exact same thing this time for the date element, text content, format date with a capital D and pass in the date. Let's now save this, go back in the browser. Oops, my mistake, guys. Let's call this one actually now. There we go. Okay. Let's go back in the browser and we can see we get 11:25 p.m. on Thursday, June 9, 2022. And we are done with the date time widget. Okay. I encourage you guys to, maybe you can even look at adding seconds to this or milliseconds because, this will update. This updates every 1/5 of a second. So once the minute goes to 26, it should update here. But I encourage you guys to add seconds to this. I also encourage you guys to look into the different methods you got here, like get hours, get minutes, and so on. And you can sort of see what they return. Okay, let's go back inside here now. We can see now it's converted to 11:26 automatically due to that set interval. That is all for today's video, guys. Hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.